Okay guys, in this video what I'm going to try to explain to you, is the difference between arteries and veins of the body. Now, in the body, in the cardiovascular system, you really have two hearts. You have the right heart, and the right heart collects all the venous blood from the body. So all the veins of the body collect all the venous blood and dump it into the right side of the heart. So all venous blood from the body gets dumped into the right side of the heart. And then that venous blood, and we know by definition, venous blood is low in oxygen and high in the waste product, carbon dioxide, right? So CO2. Why? Because the arterial system, systemic arteries, that blood is pumped by the left side of the heart. So the left side of the heart pumps blood through systemic arteries. And systemic arteries carry blood that's high in oxygen and low in carbon dioxide. Because that blood that is in the left side of the heart came from the lungs. And in the lungs, you get rid of carbon dioxide and you take on oxygen. And if you recall from our little two curved lines in a circle, right, the only place that nutrients and gases are exchanged, at least for right now, is at the systemic capillary and the cell. And we know that the arterial end of the capillary is high in oxygen, and the cell, as a waste product of metabolism, produces CO2. So when oxygen moves from high concentration in the capillary to the electron transport chain, right? So you got aerobic metabolism working. One of the byproducts is CO2. CO2 is highly concentrated in the cell and wants to go into the blood. So the point at which oxygen leaves the arterial end of the capillary and CO2 leaves the cell and goes into the capillary, arterial blood becomes venous blood. So that's why it's called circulation. It's a circle. So all the veins of the body collect that venous blood, which now is high in CO2 and low in oxygen, and all that venous blood travels through the systemic veins back to the right side of the heart. Now, so if you look, and if you watch the circulation of blood through the heart, you should have learned a couple of things. Number one, that the right and left side of the heart pump exactly the same amount of blood. And that's because, again, all the veins of the body dump their venous blood into the right side of the heart. And then the right side of the heart sends the blood to the lungs. And in the lungs, you get rid of carbon dioxide, you breathe it out, and you take on oxygen. Now that blood is newly oxygenated, and you can see the blue blood turns red, and all of that newly oxygenated blood comes back to the left heart. Now, the right side of the heart just has to pump the blood to the lungs. So it doesn't have to generate a lot of pressure. Even though the right and left side of the heart pump the same amount of blood, the right side of the heart doesn't have to work as hard because it doesn't have to generate as much pressure. But the left side of the heart has to send that oxygenated blood to every cell of your body, right? So the left side of the heart has to generate more pressure. And because it has to generate more pressure, the vessels, the systemic arteries, these guys right here, whoops, they have to be thicker, right? Think about it. Think about a garden hose. You know those newfangled garden hoses they got now? Where when you turn off the water, they shrivel up. Well, the old-fashioned garden hoses, because they had thick rubber walls, when you turned off the water, they didn't shrivel up. That's because they were thick. So think of veins like the newfangled hoses you got, right? They have a thin muscular wall so they can stretch when more water is added to them. Where arteries, systemic arteries, have thick muscular walls, so they're not going to be able to expand as much. That's why a lot of times you look at a hose and you really don't know if water's running through that thick rubber hose, because it's always round. Its diameter doesn't change that much. But those thin new hoses they got, you know water's running through there because it's stretched out. So that's how you think of arteries and veins. So we're going to talk about systemic arteries and systemic veins. Now, here is a picture of a systemic artery and a systemic vein. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain the differences to you, right? So let's first look at systemic arteries, right? Number one, they carry blood that is high in oxygen and low in carbon dioxide. So systemic arteries carry blood that's high in oxygen, low in carbon dioxide. Number two, and this is very important, they're under pressure. Right? So if you ever take somebody's blood pressure, you don't measure it in an artery, in a vein, you measure it in an artery. You measure it in the brachial artery, because there's pressure in the brachial artery, systolic and diastolic. More on that later. Because they're under pressure, look at the thickness of the muscular wall. So they have a thick muscular wall. Thick muscular wall. Why? Because they're under pressure, and that makes sense. Number four, right? They're referred to as the resistance vessels. Because they're under pressure, that's how blood flows. And what really determines the resistance in a systemic artery is really the hole that blood flows through, and that's called the lumen. And I'll explain more of that with Ohm's flow law. So systemic arteries carry blood that's high in oxygen and low in carbon dioxide. They're under pressure, so they have systolic, diastolic pressure. They have to have a thick muscular wall, which they do, and they're referred to as the resistance vessels. And now this is important. Remember that you have two separate circulations that I just explained to you. You got the right heart, which provides the pulmonary circulation or blood flow to the lungs, and then you have the systemic circulation. And the systemic circulation is supplied by the left side of the heart. So systemic arteries carry blood that's high in oxygen and low in carbon dioxide, and in the strictest of definitions, an artery takes blood away from the heart. Away from the heart. So if you look, right, here's the heart. Right? The left heart. And the systemic arteries are taking that blood away from the heart down to the cells of the body. Now, as you can see too, as you move farther and farther away from the heart and closer to the cells, the vessels progressively get, can't even do that, Smaller. Yes. That's smaller than that, we'll say. Right? Where you get down to that 1 cell thick membrane. So this is important. What I'm about to tell you next is important. Now watch. The pressure that the left heart generates when it contracts is very high in the big vessels. But as you move closer and closer to the cells of the body, the pressure progressively goes down. So near the heart, high pressure. Near the cells, low pressure. You got me? Otherwise, if the pressure went up, capillaries are 1 cell membrane thick, your heart would beat a couple of times and then blow the capillaries up in your brain, and we'd all die of a stroke. And that's bad, because you couldn't go to Gateway and take this class. I know what some of you are thinking. Yeah, I get it. How many people followed that? I hope you're following that, right? So, in the systemic arteries, when the left side of the heart contracts and sends that oxygenated blood down to the cells, the arteries progressively get smaller and the pressure inside those arteries progressively goes down. All right. Now, veins. Veins. What did I just tell you? What did I just tell you? I just told you that the pressure inside the systemic arteries, as that blood leaves the left side of the heart and gets closer and closer to the cells, progressively goes down. Now you got a cell. What happens at the cell? Well, you got the arterial end, and you have very low pressure. And that blood is a lot of oxygen. The cell, through metabolism, produces CO2. So the oxygen is going to move from high concentration in the blood to low concentration in the cells, so you can make ATP aerobically. And the CO2 is going to move from the cell into the blood, and arterial blood becomes venous blood. So, by definition, venous blood is high in carbon dioxide and low in oxygen. Very low pressure in the arterial end of the capillary. And I'm going to write this out because it's so important. I'm going to write this out. I'm going to write it out in really big, thick letters. There is no pressure in the systemic veins. No pressure. So on a test, if I were to ask you, is there any pressure in the systemic veins? You would immediately say no. Now, watch. Form and function. The body does stuff that makes sense. So if we look, systemic arteries carry oxygenated blood, high in oxygen, low in carbon dioxide, under pressure, thick muscular wall. They take blood away from the heart. And as that arterial blood gets closer and closer to the cell, the arteries get smaller until they terminate at the arterial end of the capillary. And the pressure inside those systemic arteries progressively goes down. Now, veins, systemic veins, no pressure. Look, 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 look. That's the muscular wall. Look at how thin that is compared to this. Why is it thin? because there's no pressure in the systemic veins. So a thin muscular wall in a vein, that means veins can stretch. And that also means that veins can hold extra blood. Systemic veins can hold extra blood. Why? Because they have a thin muscular wall that can stretch. So think of a balloon. You put some water in it, it's got a thin wall, it can stretch and it can accommodate more water. So veins, better write this down, veins are referred to as the capacitance vessels. Capacitance vessels. Capacitance, capacity, the ability to hold, so they can stretch and hold extra blood. What kind of blood is held in systemic veins? Blood that is high in carbon dioxide and low in oxygen. And where is all the veins of the body going to go? All the veins of the body dump their venous blood into the right side of the heart. And where does the right side of the heart pump that blood to? It pumps it to the lungs. What do you do in the lungs? You get rid of carbon dioxide and take on oxygen. Then all that newly oxygenated blood that was in the lungs, it now comes back to the left side of the heart. And the left side of the heart pumps that newly oxygenated blood that's low in CO2 through systemic arteries under pressure down to the cells of the body where gas exchange occurs. Then the veins take all of that newly venized blood that's high in CO2 and low in O2 back to the right side of the heart. That's circulation. And you're going to watch the video on the circulation of blood through the heart so you understand it. So, veins, capacitance vessels, they can stretch and hold extra blood. Are you circulating all of your venous blood all the time through your arterial system? No, you're not. Because if you had a bloody nose, then you would pass out. What does that mean? You can lose blood and still be alive. How is that possible? Well, you store extra blood. And where do you store it? In the systemic veins. You better write this down. I'm going to write it down. The largest veins of your body are deep inside muscle, specifically your leg muscles. Where are the largest veins of your body? Deep inside your leg muscles. So do you store extra blood? Yes. Where do you store extra blood? In the veins of your legs. Is there any pressure in the systemic veins? I'll help you out. No. So, if there's no pressure in the systemic veins, then how does that venous blood get back to the right side of the heart? We know how the systemic arterial blood gets down there. It gets down there by the pressure generated by the left side of the heart. But I told you, when it gets down to the capillary level, there's very little pressure, and when it gets, gases are exchanged in the veins, there's no pressure. So how does that venous blood get back to your heart if there's no pressure in the veins? Well, what do veins have? You better write this down. Veins have inside them one-way valves. Where are the largest veins of your body that store extra blood? In your legs. What do you do on occasion? You get up and you walk. And when you walk, you squish, you contract your leg muscles and you squish your veins. So watch. Look. Veins, one-way valves. And when you walk and you contract muscle, you will squish those veins like a freezy pop. And when you squish those veins, it forces open that one-way valve and it sends that venous blood towards the right side of the heart. Then what do? You relax your muscle. And when you relax that muscle, you unsquish the vein and the valve closes, and that venous blood that was here, now gets pushed up here, but it can't fall all the way back because of that one-way valve. And it is that series of contraction and relaxation of skeletal muscle that ultimately get that venous blood back to the right side of the heart. So one of the ways that you get venous blood back to your heart is through the contraction and relaxation of skeletal muscle. And that squeezing of the veins forces open the one-way valves that are in the veins, and that will progressively move venous blood back to your heart. Now watch, if any of you work in a hospital or in a nursing home, when somebody's blood pressure is low, one of the ways that you can increase it is by increasing the amount of venous blood back to the right side of the heart. Well, if somebody's blood pressure is low, like they're not doing so good, like they're almost dead, it's going to be tough to get them to get up and move. So what do? You lift their legs up, or better yet, lift the foot of the bed up where their head is lower than their legs. And by gravity, all of that venous blood that was stored in their legs will now come back to their heart. That's why when someone's blood pressure is low, you put them on their head. And you put them on their head because there's no pressure in the veins, and the only way to get that venous blood back to the heart is by taking advantage of gravity. Now, are you always contracting your legs? And what about a quadriplegic or a paraplegic? Well, the answer is this. If you look, if you had kids, a little baby, right? When you got home from the hospital, that's Spanish for hospital, they gave you a booger squeezer. And that booger squeezer was good. You liked it. Who wouldn't? Now watch. Your heart's in your mediastinum for a reason. Now watch. You're not always moving your legs, but you still got to get that venous blood back to your heart. So think of the booger squeezer and think of your lungs. What did you do when you wanted to get the booger out of your kid's nose? You squeezed the bulb, and then you stuck the bulb and the little end into the kid's nose, and as the bulb began to expand, it created like a vacuum that sucked the booger out. Well, that's how venous blood gets back to your heart. As your lungs practice it, breathe in and out. So when you breathe in, you're expanding the booger squeezer, and that is going to suck venous blood back to your heart. Now watch. when people are old and they have to take a turd, they get constipated. So what do? They take a big deep breath, but they don't blow it out. So they valsalva, and as a result, they don't get venous blood back to the heart. And as a result, you're not going to get blood to the brain and you pass out. That's why holding your breath can make you pass out, because you're not getting venous blood back to your heart. So the two ways that venous blood gets back to your heart if there's no pressure in the veins, number one, the booger squeezer, better known as the thoracic pump. Breathing sucks venous blood back to the right side of the heart. And hopefully you're always breathing. What's the other big way that venous blood gets back to your heart if there's no pressure in the veins? You got it. Veins have one-way valves. Arteries don't, because arteries are always under pressure. Veins, no pressure. So you have to generate that pressure, and how do you do it? By squishing the veins with muscle contraction and forcing open those one-way valves. Now watch. As you get older, those valves get stretched out, so they don't work so good. So you get varicose veins, and that means that blood will pool in your legs. So that venous blood settles there. That's a bad color. It's better. That venous blood settles there, and it starts pushing fluid out of the cardiovascular system into your little feetsies. That's why older people have swollen feet. And as they get older, their swollen feet turn to swollen feet and ankles. And then as they get really old, they start getting swollen legs. And if their heart goes bad, they get swollen legs. You can learn about that later. So that's the difference between arteries and veins and how venous blood gets back to your heart. I hope that helped.